My mother threw my birthday party at the most exclusive restaurant in Chicago. When I arrived, I noticed there was no seat for me at the table. I asked where I was supposed to sit, and she took a sip of her champagne, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "The floor suits you." Everyone laughed at my expense. I did not yell or cause a scene. I left silently. The next day, they turned on the television, and their arrogant smiles disappeared permanently. My name is Sienna, and I am 33 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who severely underestimated your true worth. It was a crisp November evening in Chicago. The wind blowing off Lake Michigan was biting, but the interior of Le Ciel was a masterclass in manufactured warmth and aggressive wealth. Le Ciel was the kind of fine dining establishment where getting a reservation required either a Michelin star palette or a massive trust fund. My family unfortunately relied heavily on the latter. I handed my coat to the hostess and made my way toward the private VIP dining room my mother Catherine had booked. You would think a mother booking a luxury VIP room for her daughter's 33rd birthday would be a genuine gesture of love and celebration. But in my family it was merely an opportunity for a public performance. I walked down the dim, gold-lit corridor, feeling the familiar tight knot forming in my stomach. For years I had been the scapegoat, the designated black sheep who stubbornly refused to join Vanguard Estates, our family's supposedly prestigious real estate firm. I pushed open the heavy oak doors to the private room. Before anyone even noticed my arrival, the toxic dynamic of my family hit me like a solid physical wall. My mother, Catherine, was standing over this table aggressively directing a terrified waiter on how to perfectly angle the ambient room lighting. She was not doing this to make the space look nice for my birthday celebration. She was doing it so the lighting would perfectly illuminate my younger sister, Madison. Madison, the undisputed golden child of the family, was pouting her lips at her phone camera, taking an endless stream of selfies for her social media followers. At 30 years old, Madison held the title of Vice President at Vanguard Estates, a high-ranking title she had earned entirely by being born to the right parents. She wore a dress covered in heavy, instantly recognizable designer logos, desperately trying to project overwhelming wealth. Beside her sat her husband, Andre. Andre was an African-American corporate lawyer, sharp, impeccably dressed, and completely aligned with my family's toxic brand of extreme arrogance. As I stepped further into the room, I could hear Andre boasting loudly to my father Thomas about a recent legal loophole he had exploited. Andre was laughing, bragging about how he had successfully helped his corporate law firm completely crush a small local business in a petty property dispute. My father, the chief financial officer of our family company, nodded along enthusiastically, his weak nature always eager to agree with whoever was being the loudest and most aggressive person in the room. I stood there for a long moment, quietly observing the people who shared my blood, but knew absolutely nothing about who I really was. I was wearing a tailored, double-breasted blazer and matching trousers. The fabric was Italian silk and wool, custom-made and incredibly expensive, but it completely lacked the flashy brand logos my family worshipped. To them, unbranded meant cheap and unsuccessful. To the people in my actual circle, it meant stealth wealth and true power. I cleared my throat to announce my presence to the room. The reaction was exactly what I had anticipated. My mother stopped harassing the waiter and turned to look at me. Her eyes immediately scanned my outfit from top to bottom, her expression rapidly souring into a theatrical grimace of extreme disappointment. "Sienna," she sighed loudly, her voice dripping with heavy condescension. "Could you really not make an effort for just one single night? It is your birthday dinner and you show up looking like a mid-level office manager running errands." Madison did not even look up from her glowing phone screen, but she immediately chimed in. "Honestly, it is so embarrassing to be seen with her." Andre chuckled, adjusting his luxury watch so the gold caught the light perfectly. "Leave her alone, Madison," Andre said, his deep tone thick with sarcasm and mock pity. "The startup life is hard. Not everyone can afford to dress like they actually belong in a high-end place like Le Ciel. I let the deliberate insult wash over me without reacting. Andre genuinely thought I was still running a struggling little consulting business out of a shared co-working space downtown. He loved to remind me that his law degree had bought Madison a $3 million mansion in the suburbs, while my supposed failures meant I was barely scraping by on minimum wage. None of them knew the truth. None of them knew that the startup they constantly mocked had evolved into Apex Holdings, a private equity behemoth that controlled billions in commercial assets. They did not know that I was the anonymous founder and CEO quietly pulling strings across the entire Chicago financial district. I simply offered a polite, close-lipped smile and walked toward the beautifully decorated table. But as I approached the heavy velvet chairs, my polite smile faltered. I looked around the large circular dining table, counting the formal place settings. There were exactly 12 chairs, and every single one was occupied. There was no seat left for me at all. It was the ultimate calculated insult designed to break my spirit in public. I stood frozen for a fraction of a second, my eyes scanning the meticulously arranged dining table. 12 chairs were perfectly positioned around the massive mahogany wood, each adorned with a custom-printed name card written in elegant calligraphy. I recognized the names immediately. There was Beatrice, my mother's favorite country club gossip partner. There was Chloe, Madison's personal yoga instructor. There was Marcus, a senior partner at Andre's corporate law firm. Every single chair was occupied by someone from my mother's high society circle or my sister's carefully curated entourage. There was not a single friend of mine in the room. There was not a single empty seat for the woman whose birthday they were supposedly celebrating tonight. The sheer audacity of the setup was breathtaking. My mother had not simply forgotten to add a chair. At Le Ciel, every detail was orchestrated weeks in advance by dedicated event planners. She had specifically instructed the restaurant staff to set the room for exactly 12 people, knowing fully well I was the 13th arrival. She had orchestrated this entire evening to ensure I would be left standing awkwardly at my own birthday party, completely humiliated in front of Chicago's elite. I looked directly at my mother. She was watching me closely, her eyes sparkling with dark anticipation. She was waiting for me to crumble. She wanted the tears, the stuttering, the desperate plea for acceptance that I had given her so many times during my childhood. She wanted me to ask why I was being excluded so she could publicly put me in my place and assert her dominance. I refused to give her the satisfaction of a breakdown. Instead, I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping all emotion from my tone. "Mother," I said clearly, my voice cutting through the ambient noise of the private dining room. "I see 12 place settings. Where exactly am I supposed to sit?" The low hum of conversation around the table immediately ceased. The clinking of expensive silverware halted. All 12 guests turned their attention toward me, then looked toward my mother, sensing the impending drama. This was the exact moment Catherine had been waiting for all evening. My mother did not rush to answer. She picked up her crystal flute of vintage champagne with agonizing slowness. She took a delicate sip, swallowing, before she finally allowed her cold gaze to meet mine. A cruel, triumphant smile played on her lips. "You have always insisted on doing things your own mediocre way, Sienna," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that completely failed to mask her venom. "You refuse to join Vanguard Estates. You refuse to marry a man of proper standing. You chose this difficult, unrewarding path for yourself. So just sit on the floor, darling. The floor suits you perfectly." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. I could see Beatrice averting her eyes, suddenly very interested in her linen napkin. A few other guests shifted uncomfortably in their expensive seats, completely shocked by the blatant cruelty of a mother telling her own daughter to sit on the ground like a stray animal. But that silence was abruptly broken by the sound of loud laughter. It started as a sharp giggle from Madison, who quickly covered her mouth in a feigned attempt to hide her amusement. But within seconds she dropped the act and laughed openly. Andre joined her immediately, his deep booming chuckle echoing off the restaurant walls. Their laughter was infectious to the worst kind of people, and soon a few of my mother's friends were chuckling along, validating my mother's monstrous behavior without a shred of guilt. Andre leaned back in his plush velvet chair, swirling the amber liquid in his whiskey glass. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. Madison nodded enthusiastically, reaching over to squeeze Andre's arm with manicured fingers. Exactly, she chimed in, her eyes gleaming with malice. We all have to earn our seats at the table. You cannot just expect to be treated like a VIP when you contribute absolutely nothing to the family legacy. Maybe if your little business ever actually turns a profit, we can upgrade you to a folding chair next year. More laughter erupted from their side of the table. They were reveling in their perceived superiority. They were entirely convinced that they held all the power, all the wealth, and all the status. They viewed me as a pathetic failure who had stubbornly refused their financial support and was now paying the ultimate price for my independence. They thought I was weak. They thought I was completely defenseless. I looked at Andre, taking in his arrogant posture and the expensive tailored suit he had likely purchased on credit. I knew for a fact that his law firm was currently facing a massive internal audit. I also knew exactly how heavily leveraged Madison's $3 million mansion actually was. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I did not beg for a chair, and I certainly did not sit on the floor. I simply stood there absorbing every ounce of their disrespect, cataloging their cruelty for the absolute execution I was about to unleash upon their falsely perfect lives. The dining room remained suspended in that suffocating silence. They were waiting for my breaking point. They wanted the deep satisfaction of watching my shoulders slump, of seeing my eyes well up with tears, of hearing my voice crack as I made some pathetic excuse to flee the room. My mother leaned forward slightly, her expensive diamond necklace catching the bright chandelier light, her eyes hungry for my surrender. Madison stopped recording on her phone, sensing the emotional meltdown would be better told to her friends later than filmed. Andre took another smug sip of his expensive whiskey, entirely confident that his verbal assault had secured his position as the alpha male of this twisted family dynamic. I let them enjoy their delusion for exactly 10 seconds. 10 seconds of absolute stillness, where I memorized every smirk and every ounce of their unearned arrogance. Then I moved. I reached into my tailored silk blazer and retrieved a small midnight blue velvet box. It was the gift I had originally brought for my mother, a beautiful token of appreciation purchased before realizing this dinner was an ambush. Now it served a completely different purpose. I extended my arm and placed the velvet box gently onto the center of the mahogany table, right next to a towering floral arrangement. The soft thud of the box hitting the wood echoed in the room. Catherine stared at it, her perfectly arched eyebrows knitting together in sudden confusion. Madison leaned over, her curiosity momentarily overriding her malice. Andre set his glass down, the clinking sound sharp against the quiet. I looked at my mother, allowing a slow glacial smile to spread across my face. It was not a smile of defeat, nor was it a smile of forced politeness. It was the smile of a predator realizing the trap had successfully closed around its prey. "You are absolutely right, Mother," I said, my voice echoing with terrifying clarity. "My place is certainly not at this table. Enjoy the dinner." I turned on my heel and did not look back. I did not wait for her response or Madison's snide parting remark or Andre's forced chuckle. I walked down the private dining room, my posture rigid and my head held high. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped into the main restaurant, leaving them behind in their gilded cage of ignorance and arrogance. The main dining area of Le Ciel was a blur of clinking crystal and hushed conversations. I retrieved my coat without a word from the stunned hostess and stepped through the heavy revolving glass doors. The transition was immediate and brutal. The freezing Chicago November air hit my face like a physical blow, stripping away the stifling, arrogant warmth of the restaurant. The icy wind howled down the magnificent mile, cutting straight through the thin layers of my clothing. But I did not shiver. I felt completely alive. My heart was pounding, a steady, powerful rhythm against my ribs. There were no tears threatening to fall. There was only the pure rush of adrenaline mixed with absolute calculated rage. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the freezing wind whip my hair around my face. The city lights of Chicago towered above me, a glittering canyon of glass and steel. This was my city. My family thought they owned a piece of it with their struggling real estate firm, but they were playing with pennies while I controlled the vault. I needed a moment to breathe the crisp air to let the finality of my decision settle over me. I had given them one last chance to treat me like a human being, to simply offer me a seat at a table. They had chosen to offer me the floor. Now I was going to take the entire building. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out my secondary phone. It was a secured, encrypted device unknown to anyone outside my inner circle at Apex Holdings. The screen illuminated my face in the dark street, casting a pale bluish glow against the freezing night. I bypassed the biometric security protocols and opened my direct communication channel to my executive team. They were the brightest, most ruthless financial minds in the city, and they had been on standby for weeks, waiting for my final green light. The Vanguard Estates portfolio had been sitting on my desk for a month. We had analyzed every debt, every leveraged asset, every foolish financial decision my father had made and my mother had approved. My thumbs moved rapidly across the digital keyboard. I did not hesitate. I did not second-guess myself. The emotional ties that had previously made me pause were entirely severed the moment my mother told me to sit on the floor. I typed the command with surgical precision. Activate the Vanguard Estates hostile takeover protocol. Book me on CNBC for tomorrow morning. I stared at the message for a single second, reading the words that would officially declare war on my own blood. Then I hit send. The encrypted message transmitted instantly through the network. 30 seconds later, delivery confirmations lit up my screen. The reply came immediately from my public relations head. Protocol engaged. CNBC. Morning anchor is confirmed for a 7 a.m. live exclusive. The trap is set. I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The wheels were now in motion, and there was absolutely no stopping the financial avalanche that was about to crash down on Catherine, Thomas Madison, and Andre. I calmly flagged down a black car to take me back to my penthouse. I pictured my mother still sitting in that private dining room, completely unaware that her title was about to be liquidated. The arrogant game was over. The floor was waiting for them, and I was going to make sure they got very comfortable down there, because tomorrow morning, their entire world would shatter. Morning sunlight streamed through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the Vanguard family estate. The sprawling mansion, nestled safely in one of Chicago's most exclusive and heavily guarded suburban enclaves, was a towering monument to Catherine and Thomas's relentless pursuit of social dominance. Everything in the grand dining room was designed to project unassailable wealth, from the imported Italian marble flooring that echoed with their footsteps to the custom crystal chandelier hanging majestically above the breakfast table. The air was thick with the scent of freshly brewed artisan coffee and a gourmet breakfast spread meticulously prepared by their private chef. It was a picture of absolute, undisturbed luxury. They were completely insulated in their fragile bubble of extreme privilege, utterly convinced of their own invincibility. At the head of the long glass table sat Catherine, looking perfectly composed in a designer silk robe that cost more than most people earned in a month. She buttered a piece of artisan toast with the calm, deeply satisfied demeanor of a ruthless queen who had successfully defended her golden throne. She had slept wonderfully. Banishing me from the dinner table had undoubtedly been the absolute highlight of her week. Beside her, my father Thomas, the supposed financial mastermind of the family business, casually flipped through a thick stack of printed financial reports, occasionally nodding in blind agreement with whatever his wife said. Across from them, Madison and Andre were eagerly feeding off the lingering toxic energy of last night's cruelty. Madison was busy curating her extensive social media feed, carefully selecting which heavily filtered photos from the upscale restaurant would garner the most envious comments from her superficial followers. "Can you believe she actually just walked out?" Madison scoffed, not bothering to look up from her glowing screen. "I genuinely thought she was going to cry right there in front of the waiters. It was honestly pathetic. She did not even try to fight back or defend herself. She just left that cheap little box on the table and ran away like a frightened child. Andre chuckled darkly, leaning back in his chair and stretching his arms in a display of aggressive dominance. He wore a crisp, incredibly expensive dress shirt, looking every bit the smug, untouchable corporate lawyer. He reached for a warm croissant, a cruel smirk playing heavily on his lips. What did you expect her to do, Madison? She knows she cannot possibly compete with us in any arena. I gave her a much-needed reality check. When you are running some failing little project out of a rented desk space, you do not get to sit with the successful adults. She took the exit because it was the only viable option she had left to save face. It is classic cowardice. Catherine took a delicate sip of her black coffee, her cold eyes gleaming with vindictive pleasure. Let us not waste our beautiful morning discussing Sienna and her dramatic little exit, Catherine said smoothly, dismissing my existence entirely. I offered her a heavy dose of reality. If she wants to be treated like a true member of this family, she needs to act like one. Until her imaginary startup actually produces something of tangible value, she remains an embarrassing cautionary tale. Now, Thomas, tell me about the quarterly projections. Beatrice mentioned at the club yesterday that the commercial real estate market is softening rapidly. Thomas nervously adjusted his designer reading glasses, shuffling the dense papers in his hands. His posture was perpetually subservient to Catherine's dominant, overbearing personality. He cleared his throat, attempting to project a false sense of financial confidence. Well, Catherine, the market is indeed experiencing a slight temporary downturn. The Vanguard Estates portfolio is currently carrying a rather significant amount of leveraged debt. The massive loans we took out for the new downtown high-rise development are maturing much faster than anticipated, and our liquid cash reserves are admittedly tighter than I would normally prefer. Andre stopped chewing his food, his sharp legal mind briefly catching on to the terrifying financial jargon. Tighter than you prefer, Thomas. Are we looking at a serious liquidity issue? My firm has been hearing ugly rumors about some mid-sized developers facing aggressive margin calls from the major banks. Catherine waved her manicured hand dismissively, highly irritated that the pleasant morning conversation was shifting toward anything resembling a genuine problem. Oh, please, Andre, do not be so dramatic. Vanguard Estates is a legacy institution in this city. We are not some fly-by-night operation that folds under pressure. We have deep historical relationships with every major bank in Chicago. Thomas, you simply need to restructure the debt immediately. Call Richard at Chase Bank today. He owes us a massive favor after we heavily sponsored his daughter's charity gala last spring. Of course, Catherine Thomas replied hastily, always eager to appease her endless demands. It is just a temporary cash flow squeeze. We will simply refinance the commercial loans against our prime residential properties. The banks know our family name. They highly respect our social reputation. A little debt is simply the standard cost of doing business at our elite level. We are perfectly fine. They were completely delusional. They sat in their multi-million-dollar mansion, casually discussing millions of dollars in highly toxic debt, as if it were a minor inconvenience that could be brushed away with a quick phone call to a country club friend. They foolishly believed their social status made them entirely bulletproof. They truly believed the Vanguard name was a magical shield that would forever protect them from the harsh, unforgiving realities of the ruthless financial markets. They had absolutely no idea that I had spent the entire night tirelessly analyzing every single one of those toxic loans, aggressively buying up their massive debt through anonymous proxy companies, and strategically positioning Apex Holdings to swallow their precious legacy whole. Andre grabbed the remote to turn on CNBC. Their shielded reality was ending now. Andre pointed the silver remote at the massive flat screen mounted into the marble wall of the kitchen. The screen flickered to life, immediately displaying the familiar ticker tape of stock prices scrolling across the bottom of the CNBC morning broadcast. The volume was set low enough to not disturb their lavish breakfast, but high enough for Andre to catch the opening bell highlights. Catherine took another delicate sip of her coffee, completely unbothered by the financial news, while Madison tapped away on her phone, likely posting another filtered image of her avocado toast. Thomas was still shuffling his papers, willfully ignorant of the storm gathering directly over their heads. On the television, the lead anchor, a sharp-looking man with silver hair and a serious demeanor, shuffled his notes and looked directly into the camera. He interrupted the regular market analysis with a breaking news alert graphic flashing in bright red across the screen. We have a massive, unexpected development breaking this morning in the Chicago commercial real estate sector. The anchor announced, his voice carrying the weight of a major financial earthquake. A highly aggressive overnight hostile takeover has just been successfully executed. Apex Holdings, the notoriously secretive private equity behemoth that has been quietly dominating the Midwest market for the past 5 years, has officially acquired a controlling stake in Vanguard Estates. The name of their family empire echoing from the television speakers caused an instantaneous chilling freeze in the dining room. Thomas dropped his stack of financial reports, the thick papers scattered across the imported Italian floor like dead leaves. Catherine stopped mid-sip, her porcelain cup hovering inches from her face, her meticulously applied makeup suddenly unable to hide the rapid draining of color from her cheeks. Madison slowly lowered her phone, her brow furrowing in deep, uncomprehending confusion. Andre sat bolt upright, his lawyer instincts instantly kicking into overdrive as he stared intently at the screen. "What did he just say?" Andre demanded, his voice tight with sudden, unadulterated panic. "Thomas, what exactly is he talking about?" Thomas was frantically patting his pockets, searching for his phone, his hands shaking violently. "I do not know." Thomas stammered, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. "That is impossible. We are a private legacy company. No one can just acquire a controlling stake without the board knowing." On the screen, the anchor continued his ruthless delivery of their financial ruin. Vanguard Estates, a legacy firm long considered a staple of Chicago high society, has apparently been carrying an unsustainable mountain of highly leveraged toxic debt for years. Sources indicate that Apex Holdings spent the last several weeks aggressively purchasing Vanguard's distressed commercial loans from multiple major banks, effectively cornering the family-run business and executing a flawless, predatory acquisition before the market even opened today. The anchor paused, leaning forward slightly. But the real story this morning is not just the acquisition itself. It is the identity of the buyer. For years, the founder and CEO of Apex Holdings has remained completely anonymous, steering clear of the media and operating entirely in the shadows of the financial district, the anchor explained. Today, that changes. Following the successful acquisition of Vanguard Estates, the brilliant architect behind this multi-billion-dollar private equity firm has agreed to an exclusive live-in-studio interview. Catherine was gripping the edge of the glass dining table so hard her knuckles turned stark white. Her breath hitched in her throat. She stared at the screen, her mind desperately trying to process how her entire life's work had been ripped away overnight by an unknown entity. Her heart pounded violently against her ribs as a sense of impending doom settled over the room. The absolute certainty of her privileged world was collapsing before her eyes. The camera angle shifted from the anchor desk to the guest seating area. The bright studio lights illuminated the sleek, modern chairs. And sitting there looking more powerful, calm, and effortlessly wealthy than anyone in my family had ever managed to project, was me. I was wearing the exact same unbranded silk and wool blazer they had so viciously mocked just 12 hours prior. My hair was perfectly styled, my posture was impeccable, and my eyes stared straight into the camera lens with predatory confidence. The lower third graphic flashed across the bottom of the screen. Sienna founder and CEO Apex Holdings, net worth undisclosed. The sound of shattering porcelain pierced the heavy silence of the dining room. Catherine's fingers had gone completely numb, and her expensive coffee mug slipped from her grasp, smashing into a dozen jagged pieces against the marble floor. Dark, hot coffee splattered across her designer silk robe, but she did not even flinch. She simply sat there, paralyzed, her mouth agape in a silent scream of terror. Madison let out a gasp, her phone clattering onto the glass table as she stared at my face broadcasted to millions. Andre sprang up from his chair, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. He backed away from the table, his hands gripping his hair, as his legal mind finally connected the devastating dots. The anonymous billionaire holding the strings of the city was the same woman he had confidently told to sit on the floor. Thomas began to hyperventilate, clutching his chest, as he realized that the daughter they had collectively branded a failure had just legally purchased everything he had ever built. The arrogant bubble they had lived in for decades was now officially popped. Their unearned pride evaporated into thin air as they stared at the screen in total disbelief. Madison started shaking, realizing her luxury lifestyle was funded by the company I now possessed. Andre swallowed hard, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. On the screen, I offered the anchor a warm, professional smile. "Good morning," I said smoothly, my voice echoing through the kitchen of the family that discarded me. "It is a wonderful day in Chicago." The anchor leaned in, sensing the absolute gravity of the moment. His silver pen hovered over his notes. He was a veteran of financial journalism, used to interviewing billionaires who spoke in carefully constructed, evasive corporate jargon. He was completely unprepared for the lethal, unvarnished truth I was about to deliver on live television. "Sienna," the anchor began, his tone respectful but pressing. "Vanguard Estates is not just any company. It is a legacy firm heavily associated with the prominent Chicago social scene. More importantly, it is a family-run business. The current executive board consists entirely of your immediate family. Your mother, Catherine, is the CEO. Your father, Thomas, is the CFO. Your sister, Madison, serves as vice president. Now that Apex Holdings has executed this aggressive takeover and secured a controlling stake, the entire financial sector is asking one very specific question. What is your first move regarding the current leadership team?" In the luxurious dining room of the suburban mansion, I knew exactly what was happening. I knew my mother was holding her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. I knew my father was sweating, his weak hands trembling as he stared at the screen. I knew Madison and Andre were paralyzed with fear, their arrogant illusions of superiority shattered into a million irreparable pieces. They were waiting for me to falter. They were desperately hoping I would show some sign of hesitation, some lingering shred of familial loyalty that they could later exploit. They wanted me to offer a compromise, a gentle transition, a face-saving exit that would preserve their precious social standing. They were about to be spectacularly disappointed. I did not break eye contact with the camera. I did not blink. I let the silence hang in the studio for 2 full seconds, ensuring every single viewer across the nation was hanging on my next word. I let a slow, pristine, utterly lethal smile spread across my face. It was the exact same smile I had given my mother when I left the velvet box on the table at Le Ciel. "My first move, Mark, is incredibly simple," I said, my voice echoing with absolute terrifying clarity. "I will be liquidating the current executive board immediately." The anchor's eyebrows shot up. The sheer brutality of the statement, delivered with such calm, calculated precision, was unprecedented on morning television. "Liquidating Sienna. That is a very strong word. Are you saying you intend to terminate your own parents and sister without any transition period?" "I am a businesswoman, Mark, not a charity," I replied, my tone sharpening like a perfectly honed blade. "Vanguard Estates has been horribly mismanaged for years. It has been treated not as a serious financial institution, but as a personal piggy bank to fund a lifestyle of grotesque, unearned luxury. The current board has accumulated an unsustainable mountain of toxic debt, prioritizing country club memberships and vanity real estate projects over fiscal responsibility. They have actively driven a legacy company to the absolute brink of bankruptcy." I paused, leaning forward slightly, my eyes boring directly through the camera lens, projecting my voice straight into the heart of my mother's extravagant kitchen. "I did not acquire Vanguard Estates to preserve a failing family dynasty." I declared, my words hitting like hammer blows. "I acquired it because beneath the suffocating layers of incompetence and arrogance, there are valuable core assets that my team at Apex Holdings can restructure and make highly profitable." But that restructuring cannot happen as long as the current leadership remains anywhere near the building. So yes, effective immediately, Catherine Thomas and Madison are terminated from all positions within the company. Their access badges have already been deactivated. Their corporate accounts have been permanently frozen. The anchor seemed momentarily stunned, struggling to maintain his professional detachment in the face of such a ruthless public family execution. And what about their severance, Sienna? Surely, given their long tenure and family connection, there will be some form of compensation or dignified exit package. My smile widened, transforming into something incredibly dangerous. I had been waiting 24 hours to deliver this exact sentence. I had rehearsed it in my mind while staring out at the freezing Chicago night. Now I was broadcasting it to the entire world. There will be absolutely no severance packages, I stated flatly. They have already extracted far more wealth from that company than they ever actually earned. As for a dignified exit, I believe I have provided them with the exact level of dignity they deserve. They can go to the office, pack their personal belongings into cardboard boxes, and they can sit on the floor while they do it. After all, the floor suits their level of competence perfectly. The studio fell dead silent. Even the camera operators seemed to freeze. It was a mic drop moment of epic proportions, a brutal public dismantling of my family's entire fake reality. I had taken the very words my mother used to humiliate me and weaponized them, launching them back at her with the full crushing weight of a multi-billion-dollar financial empire. I knew that right at that moment in their sprawling mansion, my family was finally experiencing the true devastating cost of underestimating me. The broadcast cut to commercial, but the execution was already complete. The queen was dead, the golden child was dethroned, and the scapegoat now owned the entire kingdom. The silence in the dining room stretched thick and suffocating long after the broadcast cut to commercial. The scent of artisan coffee and warm croissants, once a symbol of their insulated luxury, now felt nauseatingly heavy in the stagnant air. No one moved. No one spoke. They were trapped in the immediate aftermath of a financial bomb going off in their living room. Then the shrill ring of a cell phone shattered the quiet. Thomas jolted, nearly knocking over his chair as he fumbled for his phone, which had landed on the floor amidst the scattered financial reports. He grabbed it with trembling hands, his face paling even further as he read the caller ID. It was his lead accountant at Vanguard Estates. Thomas swiped to answer, pressing the phone to his ear, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, what is it?" The voice on the other end was frantic, loud enough for the entire table to hear the rising panic. "Mr. Thomas, sir, it's the banks. All of them. The corporate accounts have been frozen. Every single line of credit, every operational fund, everything. We can't even process payroll." Thomas collapsed back into his chair, the phone slipping slightly from his grasp. "Frozen? What do you mean frozen? Call Richard at Chase Bank immediately. Tell him there has been a mistake." "I did, sir," the accountant replied, his voice cracking with desperation. "Richard said he can't help us. He said the orders came directly from the new controlling entity, Apex Holdings. They've enacted a total financial lockdown pending a comprehensive audit. And sir, there's more." Catherine, who had remained frozen since her coffee mug shattered, suddenly snapped back to life. Her survival instincts, honed by years of cutthroat social climbing, overrode her shock. She snatched the phone from Thomas's weak grip, her eyes blazing with desperate fury. "What else? Speak clearly, man." "It's the access badges, ma'am," the accountant stammered, clearly intimidated by Catherine's sharp tone. "Security just informed me that the executive team's keycards have been deactivated. They were told to escort you off the premises if you attempt to enter the building. You've been locked out of Vanguard Estates." Catherine ended the call without another word. She threw the phone onto the glass table where it clattered harshly against the silence. Her chest heaved, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the edge of the table. The reality of my broadcast was manifesting with terrifying speed. I hadn't just spoken empty threats on national television, I had already executed the corporate guillotine. Andre, who had been sitting frozen, suddenly stood up and began pacing the length of the dining room. His usually immaculate posture was gone, replaced by a frantic, erratic energy. He ran his hands through his hair, his legal mind racing, connecting the devastating dots that had been hiding in plain sight for a decade. It all makes sense now, Andre muttered, his voice tight with rising panic. The anonymous proxy buyers, the aggressive debt consolidation, the sudden shifts in the Chicago commercial market. Apex Holdings wasn't just a competitor, it was a predator slowly circling the weakest herd. He stopped pacing and turned to Madison, his eyes wide with a horrific realization. Madison, do you understand what she's done? That little startup she claimed to be running? It wasn't a consulting firm. It was a multi-billion-dollar private equity behemoth. She's been building a financial empire right under our noses while we were busy making fun of her blazer. Madison shook her head, unable or unwilling to process the magnitude of the situation. No, that's impossible. Sienna is a loser. She doesn't have the connections or the capital to pull off a hostile takeover. This has to be a mistake. Someone else is pulling the strings. She's just a front. She is the founder and CEO of Apex Holdings Madison, Andre shouted, losing the last shreds of his composed corporate lawyer persona. Did you not just watch the same broadcast I did? She legally owns Vanguard Estates. She owns the company that pays my firm's retainers. She owns the company that guarantees the mortgage on our $3 million house. If Vanguard goes down, if she liquidates the assets and cancels the vendor contracts, we are ruined. Do you hear me? Ruined. The word hung in the air, a terrifying specter that none of them had ever truly faced. Ruined. It meant losing the mansion, the cars, the country club memberships, the entire facade of their superior existence. It meant becoming everything they had always despised. Catherine slammed her hand onto the table, the sharp crack silencing Andre's panic. She stood up, her posture rigid, her eyes burning with a furious, unyielding denial. She refused to accept defeat. She refused to believe that the daughter she had deemed worthless had outsmarted and overpowered her. Enough! Catherine commanded, her voice cutting through the rising hysteria. I will not stand here and listen to this pathetic whining. We are the Vanguard family. We built this city. I will not allow some ungrateful, spiteful child to steal my legacy through cowardly backdoor financial manipulation. She turned to Thomas, who was staring blankly at the shattered coffee mug on the floor. Thomas, get up. Call the legal team. Tell them to draft an emergency injunction to halt any further action by Apex Holdings. We will tie her up in court until she begs for mercy. Catherine, I don't think you understand, Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. The banks have already frozen our accounts. We don't have the liquid capital to pay the retainer for a legal team capable of fighting a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm. We are locked out. Catherine's eyes narrowed, a dangerous, desperate glint replacing her earlier shock. Then we will handle this directly. She thinks she can hide behind a television screen and an army of corporate lawyers. She thinks she can humiliate me in front of the entire nation and simply walk away. She grabbed her designer handbag from the chair next to her, her movements jerky and aggressive. Madison, get your coat. Andre, get the car. We are going to her address right now. I don't care if she's hiding in some cheap rented office space or a luxury condo. We are going to find her, and we are going to put her in her place. She is going to learn exactly what happens when you cross this family. The drive from the sprawling suburban estate to downtown Chicago was a masterclass in suffocating tension. Catherine sat perfectly rigid in the passenger seat of Andre's aggressively leased Mercedes, her knuckles white as she gripped her designer handbag. She stared straight ahead at the highway, refusing to acknowledge the profound humiliation that had just been broadcast to the entire nation. Thomas sat in the back, silently sweating his mind, desperately calculating exactly how many days they had before their creditors started seizing physical assets. Madison was frantically deleting comments on her social media, her influencer facade crumbling in real time as the news of the Vanguard takeover spread like wildfire through her superficial circle. Andre drove with a reckless, frantic energy, his knuckles tight on the steering wheel. He was desperately trying to convince himself that he could use his corporate law degree to intimidate me into backing down. He truly believed he could simply walk into whatever small rented office space he assumed I operated from and threaten me with enough legal jargon to force a settlement. He had no idea where we were actually going. I had always ensured that any mail or document sent to my family used a P.O. box or a discreet forwarding service. They had never known my actual address. When the GPS finally chimed announcing they had reached their destination, Andre pulled the car to a sudden, jerky stop. He stared out the windshield, his confident expression immediately faltering. Catherine leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked up at the towering structure before them. "This cannot be right." Catherine snapped, her voice tight with disbelief. "The GPS must have malfunctioned. She would not be located here." They were parked in front of the Azure, one of the most exclusive ultra-luxury residential and commercial high-rises in the heart of Chicago's Gold Coast. The building was a masterpiece of modern architecture, a gleaming spire of glass and steel that offered unparalleled panoramic views of Lake Michigan. It was known as a fortress for billionaires, housing prominent tech founders, international diplomats, and hedge fund titans. It was precisely the kind of address Catherine had spent her entire life desperately trying and failing to secure for Vanguard Estates. Andre double-checked the address I had deliberately provided to the Vanguard accountants during the freezing of the corporate accounts. The numbers matched perfectly. "This is the address she gave," Andre said, his voice losing a significant amount of its previous bravado. "It is the only registered address we have for Apex Holdings." Catherine scowled, refusing to accept the reality staring her in the face. "She is probably renting a small closet on the ground floor to look important. Or she is just using it as a mailing address. Get out of the car. We are going inside." The family exited the vehicle, their collective arrogance momentarily returning as they approached the grand polished brass doors of the Azure. They expected the usual deferential treatment they demanded everywhere else in the city. Catherine marched straight toward the massive semicircular concierge desk, her designer heels clicking sharply against the imported marble floor. "Excuse me," Catherine demanded, not bothering to offer a polite greeting. "We are here to see Sienna. She is my daughter. Tell her that her family has arrived and we expect to be brought up immediately." The head concierge, a meticulously groomed man named Harrison, did not flinch at her aggressive tone. He had dealt with royalty and celebrities. A frantic, disgraced real estate CEO did not impress him in the slightest. He calmly checked his digital registry, his expression remaining perfectly neutral. "I am sorry," Madam Harrison replied smoothly. "I do not have a visitor request under your name. Access to the residential floors is strictly prohibited without prior authorization from the penthouse owner." Catherine slammed her hand down on the marble desk, her frustration boiling over. "Do not play games with me. I am Catherine, CEO of Vanguard Estates. The woman you are protecting is my daughter. She works here. You will grant us access right now, or I will ensure your management company hears about your gross incompetence." Harrison did not even blink. He slowly looked up from his screen, his gaze cool and detached. "Madam, as of this morning, Vanguard Estates is a subsidiary of Apex Holdings, and the owner of the penthouse, who is also the CEO of Apex Holdings, has placed a strict security hold on her residence. You are not on the approved guest list. I must ask you to step away from the desk." Madison stepped forward, trying to use her usual tactic of aggressive entitlement. "You are just a glorified doorman. Do you have any idea who we are? We are not leaving until we see her." Andre, attempting to assert his legal authority, puffed out his chest and leaned over the desk. "Listen to me very carefully. I am a senior corporate attorney. You are unlawfully impeding our access to a family member during a critical business dispute. If you do not let us up that elevator right now, I will personally see to it that you are tangled in litigation for the rest of your natural life." Harrison simply pressed a discreet button under his desk. Within seconds, 4 towering security guards dressed in immaculate dark suits materialized from the shadows of the lobby. They moved with silent, synchronized precision, forming a solid, impenetrable wall between my family and the private elevators. "Sir," the lead security guard said, his voice deep and rumbling with unmistakable authority, "you are currently trespassing in a private secured building. If you do not vacate the lobby immediately, we will forcibly remove you and involve the Chicago Police Department." The utter humiliation was palpable. Catherine, who had spent decades demanding VIP treatment, was being treated like a common vagrant. Madison shrank back, her bravado evaporating, as she realized her social status meant absolutely nothing in this building. Andre's mouth opened and closed, his legal threats dying in his throat as he stared at the heavily armed security personnel. Thomas simply looked defeated, already mentally preparing for the police to arrive. They were completely powerless. They stood in the grand lobby, staring at the elevators they could not access, realizing they were entirely at my mercy. 40 stories above them, I sat in the expansive sunlit living room of my penthouse. The walls were pure glass, offering an unobstructed, breathtaking view of the vast churning waters of Lake Michigan. I held a tablet in my hand, watching the high-definition security feed from the lobby. I watched my mother's face contort with rage. I watched Andre's pathetic attempt at intimidation fail spectacularly. I watched them realize that the daughter they had told to sit on the floor now lived in the sky. I let them suffer the humiliation for 3 full minutes. I let the reality of their complete lack of control sink deep into their bones. Then I tapped a button on my tablet, opening a direct audio channel to Harrison at the concierge desk. "Harrison," I said, my voice projecting clearly into his earpiece. "You may send them up. Just the family. Ensure they are escorted directly to the private elevator. Let us finish this." I set the tablet down on the marble coffee table and stood up. I smoothed the lapels of my unbranded silk blazer. The opening act of my revenge was complete. Now it was time for the main event. It was time to bring them into my world and show them exactly what true power looked like. The private elevator doors glided open with a soft, expensive chime, revealing the vast expanse of my penthouse. The morning sun poured through the wraparound windows, illuminating the sleek, modern art, the custom furniture, and the panoramic view of Lake Michigan that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. It was a space designed for clarity and absolute control. I stood behind my massive white marble kitchen island waiting for them. Catherine stepped off the elevator first, her designer heels clicking against the polished hardwood. The instant she crossed the threshold, her entire demeanor shifted. The furious, demanding woman who had just tried to bully my concierge vanished. In her place was a masterpiece of manufactured vulnerability. Her shoulders slumped slightly, her expression softened into a mask of maternal concern, and her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. It was a performance I had seen countless times throughout my life, a weaponized display of emotion designed to completely disarm and manipulate her target. Madison followed closely behind, looking uncharacteristically small as she took in the staggering wealth surrounding her. Andre stepped out last, his eyes darting around the room, assessing the value of every single object, with the desperate calculation of a man realizing he was severely outmatched. Thomas hovered in the background, a silent, sweating shadow. "Sienna, darling." Catherine breathed, her voice trembling with perfect, agonizing precision. She took a tentative step forward, her hands clasped together against her chest. "I am so relieved we found you. We have been simply out of our minds with worry since you left the restaurant last night." I did not move. I rested my hands flat against the cold marble of the island, my face a mask of absolute indifference. I let her continue her desperate performance. "What happened on the broadcast this morning?" Catherine continued, a solitary tear finally spilling over her lashes, tracing a careful path down her cheek. "It was shocking, Sienna. Just shocking. But I know you, sweetheart. I know my own daughter. You are upset, and you have every right to be. I admit my behavior at the restaurant was harsh. It was inexcusable. But you must understand it came from a place of deep, profound love." Madison let out a small, involuntary scoff, but a sharp look from Andre silenced her instantly. They needed Catherine's manipulation to work. It was their only remaining strategy. "It was tough love, Sienna," Catherine pleaded, taking another step closer, her voice thick with fake emotion. "Your father and I have always known you had this incredible, untapped potential. We knew you were capable of greatness, but you were always so stubborn, so determined to struggle on your own. I pushed you last night because I wanted to ignite that fire within you. I wanted you to finally stand up and claim your power. And look at what you have accomplished. I am so incredibly proud of you, my brilliant girl." The sheer audacity of her gaslighting was breathtaking. In less than 60 seconds, she had attempted to rewrite history, transforming a vicious public humiliation into a calculated act of maternal inspiration. She was actually trying to take credit for the decade of grueling work I had put into building Apex Holdings. She genuinely believed that if she cried enough fake tears and invoked the sacred bond of family blood, I would simply fold, forgive her monstrous behavior, and hand Vanguard Estates right back to her. But this was not about family anymore. This was a hostile takeover, and the time for emotional manipulation had expired. I did not yell, I did not raise my voice or match her theatrical emotional pitch. I simply reached under the marble island and pulled out a thick, heavy leather-bound dossier. The gold-embossed Apex Holdings logo gleamed on the cover. I slid it across the smooth surface of the marble. It stopped exactly an inch from the edge directly in front of Catherine. "You can stop the performance, Catherine," I said, my voice echoing with the cold, detached precision of a corporate executioner. "The cameras are off. The audience is gone. There is no one left here to manipulate." Catherine stared at the dossier, her fake tears instantly drying up. The mask of the loving mother slipped, revealing the terrified, cornered CEO beneath. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice losing its trembling vulnerability. That I replied smoothly as a comprehensive forensic accounting of Vanguard Estates conducted over the past month by my top financial analysts at Apex Holdings. I suggest you open it. Andre, unable to resist his legal instincts, stepped forward and opened the heavy leather cover. His eyes scanned the first page, his brow furrowing in deep concentration. Madison leaned over his shoulder, trying to decipher the dense financial spreadsheets. Thomas remained frozen by the elevator, unwilling to look at the physical proof of his own massive failures as CFO. As Andre turned the pages, the color rapidly drained from his face. The dossier was a meticulous, irrefutable chronicle of financial ruin. It detailed every toxic loan, every leveraged asset, and every disastrous decision made under Catherine's leadership. But more importantly, it highlighted the exact source of the hemorrhage. "Let me save you the trouble of reading the executive summary," I said, leaning forward slightly, commanding the absolute attention of the room. "Vanguard Estates is not suffering from a temporary market downturn, as my father so foolishly suggested this morning. Vanguard Estates is bleeding to death because of you, Catherine." Catherine bristled, her defensive instincts flaring. "That is a lie. I have guided this company through multiple recessions. I am the face of this brand. You are the reason this brand is weeks away from declaring Chapter 11 bankruptcy," I countered sharply, my voice cutting through her delusions. "The audit clearly shows that over the past 5 years, you have treated the corporate operational accounts as your personal slush fund. The renovations to the suburban estate, the aggressive expansion into luxury markets that yielded zero return on investment, the constant exorbitant spending to maintain your fragile social status among the Chicago elite. You leveraged the core assets of the company to fund your own vanity projects, Catherine. You mortgaged the future of Vanguard Estates to pay for your designer wardrobe and your country club galas." Andre looked up from the dossier, his eyes wide with undeniable panic. He looked at Thomas. "Is this true? Are we really this over-leveraged?" Thomas could not meet his son-in-law's gaze. He stared at the floor, confirming everything with his pathetic silence. "The math does not lie," I stated, tapping the marble island for emphasis. "Your debt-to-equity ratio is catastrophic. The banks were already preparing margin calls. If I had not stepped in and aggressively purchased your distressed debt, Vanguard Estates would have been publicly humiliated in bankruptcy court before the end of the quarter. I did not steal your company, Catherine. I salvaged it from the wreckage of your own crippling vanity." Catherine stared at me, the reality of her total failure finally penetrating her thick armor of arrogance. The tough love narrative was dead. The illusion of her superiority was completely shattered. She stood in my $15 million penthouse, staring at the irrefutable proof that she had destroyed her own legacy and that the daughter she had told to sit on the floor was the only reason her name had not already been dragged through the financial mud. The silence in the penthouse stretched thick and suffocating as the gravity of the dossier settled over the room. Catherine stared at the leather-bound document, her manicured hands trembling slightly. Thomas looked physically ill, swaying on his feet as the reality of his financial incompetence was laid bare. Madison clung to Andre's arm, her eyes darting frantically between her husband and the irrefutable evidence of their impending ruin. But Andre, the ever-confident corporate lawyer, refused to surrender his illusion of power. He stepped away from Madison, adjusting his expensive tie with a sharp, aggressive movement. The shock that had initially paralyzed him was quickly replaced by a desperate, calculating fury. He was cornered, his lavish lifestyle threatened, and his instinct was to attack. "You think you are untouchable because you managed to execute a stealth acquisition?" Sienna Andre sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You think presenting a few spreadsheets in a fancy penthouse makes you a titan of industry? But you have no idea who you are dealing with. I have destroyed companies 10 times the size of Apex Holdings before my morning coffee." I remained perfectly still, my expression unreadable. I watched him puff out his chest, attempting to inflate his authority in a room where he had absolutely none. "You have made a catastrophic miscalculation." Andre continued, his voice rising in volume as he paced in front of the marble island. "This was not a standard acquisition. This was a predatory, hostile takeover executed with a complete lack of transparency and a blatant disregard for fiduciary duty. The speed at which you moved, the anonymity you maintained, the aggressive purchase of distressed debt. It all reeks of market manipulation and unethical business practices." He stopped pacing and pointed a perfectly manicured finger at me, his eyes narrowing to angry slits. "I am going to file an emergency injunction before the ink on your acquisition papers is even dry. I will petition the court to freeze every single asset connected to Apex Holdings pending a full federal investigation. I will claim predatory lending practices, tortious interference with business contracts, and a gross violation of the Securities Exchange Act." Madison, sensing a shift in the power dynamic, rallied behind her husband. She straightened her posture, her arrogant smirk returning as she looked at me. "You hear that, Sienna? You thought you were so smart, but you just handed Andre the perfect case to destroy you. You are going to lose everything." Andre did not even acknowledge Madison's support. He was entirely focused on tearing me down, on proving that his Ivy League education and corporate pedigree made him infinitely superior to the woman he had told to sit on the floor. "And that is just the corporate side of the litigation," Andre added, his voice dropping to a menacingly low register. "We are also going to file a massive civil suit against you personally. Intentional infliction of emotional distress, defamation of character, harassment. We will argue that your entire acquisition strategy was driven not by legitimate business interests, but by a sick, vindictive vendetta against your own family. We will paint you as a bitter, unstable woman who used her ill-gotten wealth to orchestrate a public execution of her own parents." He leaned forward, resting his hands on the marble island, his face inches from the dossier. "The media will eat it up, Sienna. The brilliant anonymous billionaire exposed as a petty, vindictive sociopath. Your investors will flee. Your board will turn on you. I will personally drag you through depositions and discovery for the next decade. I will tie you up in so much litigation that you will be begging for a settlement just to cover your legal fees. I will bleed you and your little company completely dry." The performance was masterful. He threw every intimidating legal term he could think of, attempting to build a fortress of jargon and threats around his fragile ego. He genuinely believed that if he sounded aggressive enough, if he projected enough certainty, I would cower in fear and hand Vanguard estates back to his family just to avoid the hassle. He expected me to argue. He expected me to defend my acquisition strategy, to counter his legal threats with my own, to engage in a messy emotional screaming match that would validate his narrative of the bitter, unstable daughter. I did not give him the satisfaction. I let his threats echo in the vast open space of the penthouse. I let him bask in his imagined victory for exactly 5 seconds. I looked at the smug satisfaction radiating from his face, and I felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical anticipation. He had presented his opening argument. Now it was time for the verdict. I did not blink. I did not shift my weight or offer a single syllable of defense against his barrage of legal intimidation. I simply reached across the cool marble surface of the kitchen island and picked up my slim silver tablet. The entire room held its breath, completely unnerved by my absolute lack of reaction. Andre's arrogant smirk began to falter just slightly at the corners of his mouth as the heavy silence stretched far beyond the point of comfort. He had expected fire and brimstone. He had anticipated a desperate emotional defense that he could pick apart with his sharp lawyer logic. Instead, he was facing a glacier. I tapped a single icon on the glass screen. A soft, mechanical whirring sound resonated from the ceiling above the expansive living area. A massive high-definition projector screen descended smoothly from a concealed slot, rolling down to cover the panoramic view of Lake Michigan. The sudden blockage of natural sunlight cast a sharp cinematic shadow over the penthouse, instantly transforming the luxurious residential space into a sterile, high-stakes corporate boardroom. The sophisticated projector flickered to life, casting a bright, crisp rectangle of glaring light across the room. Every eye in the room darted toward the screen. Catherine, Thomas, Madison, and Andre all turned simultaneously, expecting to see more internal Vanguard data, or perhaps a complex diagram of Apex Holdings' corporate structuring. What illuminated the screen, however, had absolutely nothing to do with standard corporate acquisitions or real estate market trends. It was a highly detailed, meticulously organized spreadsheet displaying international wire transfers, hidden routing numbers, and offshore corporate entity registrations. The distinctive logos of discrete banking institutions located in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas were prominently displayed at the very top of the financial documents. Andre took a staggering step back, the blood completely draining from his face. His perfectly tanned complexion turned a sickly ashen gray in a matter of seconds. His jaw slackened and the aggressive posturing corporate lawyer vanished entirely, replaced instantly by a terrified cornered animal staring directly into the headlights of oncoming traffic. He knew exactly what he was looking at. "You are a very skilled orator, Andre," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the quiet, shadowed room. "You throw around complex legal terms like fiduciary duty and market manipulation with incredible conviction. You demand absolute transparency and highly ethical business practices from me. So in the spirit of that absolute transparency, I decided to have my elite forensic accounting team conduct a deep, uncompromising dive into the specific vendor contracts and legal retainers authorized by Vanguard Estates over the past 36 months. I tapped my tablet again. The screen zoomed in aggressively on a specific series of repetitive wire transfers, highlighting the staggering dollar amounts in bright, undeniable crimson ink. We found some genuinely fascinating discrepancies. I continued stepping around the marble island and walking slowly, deliberately toward him. We discovered a remarkably consistent pattern of authorized payments sent directly from Vanguard operational accounts to a mysterious series of shell companies registered in the Caribbean. Shell companies that, after a very brief investigation by my private intelligence contractors, were directly and inextricably linked to your personal social security number. Thomas let out a choked, wet gasp, finally looking up from the floor. He stared at the giant screen, his eyes widening in horror as his sluggish mind processed the familiar routing numbers he had personally signed off on month after month, completely unaware of their true destination. Over the past 2 years, I stated, my voice echoing like a judge reading a final death sentence. You have systematically embezzled $2 million from Vanguard Estates. You drained my family's struggling company to feed a severe, spiraling underground gambling addiction. You used fake legal retainers and phantom consulting fees to cover your massive, humiliating losses at illegal high-stakes poker games across the Midwest. Andre opened his mouth to speak, to deny it, to spin some miraculous, complicated legal lie that would save his skin, but his voice completely failed him. He was suffocating under the crushing weight of his own criminal exposure. Madison stared at the glowing screen, her eyes darting frantically between the offshore account balances and the terrifyingly large gambling debts listed right beside them. Her expensive designer handbag slipped from her shoulder, hitting the hardwood floor with a dull, heavy thud. The pristine, flawless narrative of her perfect marriage was disintegrating right before her eyes. The $3 million mansion, the luxury cars, the endless obnoxious bragging about her husband's elite corporate success on social media. It was all a complete illusion, built entirely on a foundation of theft and degenerate addiction. I walked over to the marble coffee table and picked up a sleek black folder. I pulled out two separate thick stacks of paper and dropped them onto the glass surface right in front of Andre. "There are two distinct documents on this table, Andre," I said, pointing to the crisp white papers. "The first is a full, unconditional resignation from your prestigious corporate law firm, explicitly acknowledging your gross ethical violations. The second is a set of fully drafted divorce papers, irrevocably severing your marriage to my sister and completely waiving any future claim to spousal support or Vanguard assets." I pulled my secondary phone from my blazer pocket, holding it up high so he could clearly see the screen. "I have an encrypted digital file containing every single piece of evidence currently displayed on that projector. It is loaded and currently addressed to the White Collar Crime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, as well as the Illinois State Bar Association." I tapped the timer application on my screen, setting it for exactly 1 minute. I pressed start. "You have exactly 60 seconds, Andre," I said, my tone absolute cold and entirely unyielding. "Sign the resignation and the divorce papers today right now, or this highly damaging file goes directly to the FBI. You will be completely disbarred by tomorrow morning, and you will be facing severe federal prison time for wire fraud and major embezzlement before the end of the week." The digital timer ticked down silently on my phone screen, a terrifying countdown to his total personal and professional destruction. 50 seconds. 45 seconds. Andre lunged toward the glass table, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the silver pen I had left beside the documents. He did not read the terms. He did not attempt to negotiate or plead for mercy. He frantically scribbled his signature across the bottom of both stacks of paper, tears of absolute panic and crushing defeat streaming freely down his face. He dropped the pen, gasping for air, as if he had been drowning in freezing water. Madison stared at the man she had worshipped, the man she had used to belittle and humiliate me for years. He was a thief, a liar, and an absolute coward. A raw, guttural scream ripped from her throat, shattering the tension in the room. She launched herself forward and slapped Andre across the face with everything she had. The sharp, violent crack of her hand against his cheek echoed through the penthouse. The golden couple was dead, destroyed in an instant, leaving nothing but the pathetic, shattered pieces of their fake reality scattered across my floor. Madison did not stop with a single slap. She shoved Andre hard against the edge of the marble island, her perfectly manicured nails clawing at the expensive fabric of his suit jacket. She screamed at him, demanding to know how he could be so incredibly stupid to steal from her own mother. Andre did not fight back. He kept his head down, grabbing the signed resignation and divorce papers before stumbling backward toward the private elevator. He keyed the descent button frantically, refusing to look at his soon-to-be ex-wife or the family he had just bankrupted. The doors slid shut, sealing him inside. Madison sank to her knees right there on my hardwood floor, burying her face in her hands and sobbing loudly. Catherine and Thomas stood completely paralyzed. The invincible armor they had worn for decades had been entirely stripped away in less than 20 minutes. I had systematically dismantled their company, their son-in-law, and their golden child. I picked up my tablet and politely informed them that my security team would escort them out. I advised them to use the remaining time today to pack their personal belongings at the Vanguard corporate office before my transition team changed the locks at midnight. They did not argue. They gathered the weeping Madison and retreated to the elevator in absolute defeat. But a narcissistic mind does not simply accept defeat. It retreats, it recalculates, and it mutates into something significantly more dangerous. 48 hours after I banished them from my penthouse, the retaliation began. I was sitting in my downtown corner office at Apex Holdings, reviewing the restructuring plans for the Vanguard commercial properties, when my head of public relations burst through the double glass doors. He did not bother knocking. He dropped a stack of printed articles and a tablet onto my desk. His face was grim. I picked up the tablet. The headline from a prominent Chicago financial gossip blog screamed in bold red letters. The Anonymous Billionaire, Unmasked. Apex Holdings CEO suffers severe mental breakdown in hostile family takeover. I swiped to the next article from a major local tabloid. A family torn apart. Loving parents desperately seek help for erratic billionaire daughter. Catherine had gone to the press. Stripped of her company and her unearned wealth, she had resorted to the dirtiest, most vicious tactic available to a desperate narcissist. She was launching a full-scale, highly coordinated smear campaign to completely destroy my public reputation. I read through the articles, my blood turning to ice water. Anonymous sources, which were undoubtedly my mother and father, had painted a wildly fabricated narrative. They claimed that my anonymous status for the past decade was not a strategic business maneuver, but a desperate attempt to hide a severe, untreated mental illness. They told reporters that my acquisition of Vanguard Estates was not a calculated financial decision, but a manic, vindictive episode driven by delusions and paranoia. They portrayed themselves as terrified, unconditionally loving parents who were merely trying to guide their sick daughter, only to be punished by her reckless billion-dollar spending spree. They did not stop with anonymous quotes to the tabloids. Catherine knew that to truly threaten my control over Apex Holdings, she needed legal leverage. She needed to legally convince the state of Illinois that I was entirely incapable of managing my own life and my vast financial empire. My public relations director handed me a heavy legal envelope that had just been served to our corporate reception desk. It was an emergency petition filed in the Cook County Probate Court. Catherine and Thomas were officially seeking a conservatorship over me. They were petitioning a judge to grant them immediate legal control over my personal autonomy, my medical decisions, and my entire financial portfolio. I opened the thick legal filing. Attached to the petition as Exhibit A were my private medical records from college. 12 years ago, when their relentless emotional abuse and impossible expectations had finally broken me, I had sought treatment at the University Health Clinic for severe depression and anxiety. I had been prescribed medication. I had attended intensive therapy. It was the darkest, most vulnerable period of my entire life, a direct result of their toxic parenting. Now Catherine had illegally unearthed those sensitive medical records and weaponized them. Her lawyers had twisted my past trauma into a fictitious present reality. The legal petition argued that my decision to cut off all contact with my family a decade ago was not a healthy boundary set by an abused child, but the beginning of a prolonged, dangerous psychotic break. They claimed my intense focus on building Apex Holdings was a symptom of dangerous financial hoarding and manic grandiosity. They were utilizing the exact same legal framework that had famously trapped pop stars and vulnerable heirs. They were playing the role of the weeping, desperate parents whose only wish was to save their sick daughter from destroying herself. Their goal was brutally clear. If a judge granted the emergency conservatorship, Catherine would immediately gain legal authority to sign documents on my behalf. She would instantly reverse the Vanguard Estates acquisition, drain the liquid assets of Apex Holdings to pay off her own massive debts, and lock me away in some luxury psychiatric facility where I could never threaten her social standing again. It was a breathtakingly evil strategy. They were attempting to steal my massive company by legally erasing my basic human rights. They thought that by exposing my deepest, most painful past vulnerabilities to the entire world, I would crumble under the intense public humiliation and surrender my empire just to make the media circus stop. They genuinely believed that the scared, depressed college student they had discarded 12 years ago was still hiding somewhere inside me. They were about to find out how incredibly wrong they were. I was going to completely destroy this petition and leave them with absolutely nothing to their names. I walked out of my private office and strode directly down the hall toward the main glass-walled boardroom of Apex Holdings. I did not run. I did not rush. I moved with the measured, predatory grace of a CEO who was entirely in control of her environment. Through the soundproof glass, I could see my executive board already assembled. These were 12 of the most ruthless, battle-tested financial minds in the Midwest. They managed billions of dollars in institutional wealth, and they did not handle public scandals well. The massive screens lining the boardroom walls were muted, but I could see the blazing red chyrons of the financial news networks reporting on the rumors of my supposed mental collapse. When I pushed open the heavy glass doors, the frantic murmuring ceased instantly. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like physical pressure against my chest. Victor Cole, my lead institutional investor, and the unofficial chairman of the board stood at the far end of the long mahogany table. He looked grim. He gestured to a printed copy of the emergency conservatorship petition resting on the polished wood. "Sienna, we have a massive problem," Victor stated, completely skipping any polite formalities. "Investor confidence is plummeting. Institutional backers are calling my phone every 5 minutes demanding answers. The Chicago tabloids are running wild with stories about your family, filing for legal control over your medical and financial decisions. They are openly claiming that the Vanguard Estates acquisition was the result of a severe manic episode. We need you to explain exactly what is going on, and we need you to do it right now." A secondary board member, a conservative venture capitalist named Donovan, chimed in before I could even take my seat. "The optics on this are catastrophic. We manage vast sums of private wealth. Our clients demand absolute stability. If there is even a fraction of a percent of truth to these medical allegations, we have a fiduciary duty to protect this firm. I am putting forward a motion for you to take an immediate temporary leave of absence. We need to install an interim CEO until this highly damaging family dispute is resolved." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. It was a textbook corporate mutiny. They were terrified of the negative press, and their immediate instinct was to amputate the perceived infected limb to save the corporate body. They wanted me to step down, surrender my power, and hide in the shadows until the scandal blew over. I walked to the head of the table. I did not sit down. I placed both hands flat on the mahogany surface and leaned forward, sweeping my gaze across the faces of the 12 men and women who had just attempted to strip me of my empire. "Nobody is taking a leave of absence," I said, my voice echoing with terrifying absolute calm. "And nobody is stepping down. If any of you actually believe I am suffering from a mental breakdown, you are vastly underestimating the woman who generated a 40% return on your initial investments last year." I picked up the remote control and bypassed the news channels, switching the main boardroom screens to our secure internal financial dashboard. "Look at the screens," I commanded. "Do not look at the tabloids. Look at the raw data." The screens illuminated with complex financial models, real-time asset valuations, and projected quarterly earnings. I had spent the previous night running the exact numbers on the Vanguard restructuring. "Catherine and Thomas filed that absurd legal petition because they are completely destitute," I explained, slicing through their panic with cold, hard facts. "They leaked those stories to the press because I exposed their massive corporate fraud and fired them on national television. They are cornered animals lashing out. Now look at the projected revenue from the Vanguard commercial portfolio liquidation." I highlighted a specific column on the screen. "By aggressively restructuring their toxic debt and selling off their underperforming vanity projects, Apex Holdings will absorb a net profit of $400 million within the next 90 days. That is not the frantic guesswork of an unstable mind. That is a perfectly executed, ruthlessly efficient corporate acquisition." The board members stared at the staggering profit projections. The color began to return to their faces as the raw math completely obliterated the tabloid gossip. Furthermore, I continued, reaching into my briefcase and tossing a stack of thick black folders down the length of the table. I instructed my legal team to compile a comprehensive background report on my parents. Inside those folders, you will find irrefutable proof that my mother and father have been systematically embezzling from a private trust fund for the past decade. You will also find documentation of their son-in-law stealing $2 million to cover illegal gambling debts. Victor opened the folder in front of him, his eyes scanning the damning financial records. He looked up at me, the initial skepticism entirely replaced by profound, genuine respect. "They filed for the conservatorship to stop you from exposing their own crimes," he realized aloud. "Exactly," I replied. They thought they could use my past vulnerability against me. They thought bringing up a depressive episode from my college years would spook my investors and force me into a settlement. They assumed I would cower in the face of a public relations nightmare. I stood up straight, projecting absolute unshakable dominance over the room. I want all of you to brace yourselves. I am not settling. I am not hiding. I have secured the most vicious defense attorneys in the state of Illinois. We are going into closed chambers tomorrow morning, and I am going to legally execute that petition with extreme prejudice. I looked directly at Donovan, the board member who had suggested I step down. If anyone in this room lacks the stomach for a fight, you are welcome to sell your shares back to the company today. But if you stand by me, I promise you that by tomorrow afternoon, the media narrative will completely flip and Apex Holdings will emerge stronger, wealthier, and more feared than ever before. The room was dead silent. I had not just quelled a mutiny, I had completely rewired their perception of my leadership. I had demonstrated that I was utterly impervious to emotional manipulation and public pressure. Victor closed the black folder and pushed the emergency petition away. He looked around the table, meeting the eyes of the other board members. No one moved to sell their shares. No one spoke a word of dissent. "We stand with you, Sienna," Victor declared, his voice firm and absolute. "Destroy them." I offered a single tight nod. The board was secured. The corporate fortress was locked down. Now it was time to step into the courtroom and spring the legal trap that would obliterate Catherine and Thomas forever. The heavy oak doors of the judge's private chambers closed with a solid, echoing thud, sealing us inside the wood-paneled room. The air was instantly thick with tension, a stark contrast to the sterile, brightly lit corridors of the Cook County courthouse we had just navigated. This was not an open courtroom. It was an emergency, closed-door hearing, a highly expedited process, granted only under the most severe circumstances, or in this case, the most aggressively fabricated ones. Judge Iris Thorne, a seasoned jurist with silver hair and a reputation for absolute unyielding pragmatism, sat behind a massive desk. She peered over her reading glasses, surveying the opposing forces gathered before her. On one side of the polished mahogany table sat my mother Catherine, accompanied by my father Thomas, and a team of high-priced probate attorneys they had undoubtedly hired on credit. Catherine had dressed for the occasion with calculated precision. The usual flashy designer logos and aggressive diamonds were gone. Instead, she wore a muted conservative gray suit. Her makeup was deliberately subdued, designed to emphasize the dark circles under her eyes. She looked fragile, exhausted, and perfectly cast in the role of a desperate, heartbroken matriarch fighting to save her sick child. On the opposite side, I sat perfectly still, flanked by three of the most vicious, relentless corporate defense litigators in Chicago. I wore a sharp, tailored black suit, projecting nothing but absolute competence and icy control. I did not look at my parents. I kept my gaze fixed steadily on Judge Thorne. The judge cleared her throat, opening the thick file resting on her desk. "We are here today to address an emergency petition for conservatorship filed by Catherine and Thomas Vanguard concerning their daughter Sienna Vanguard." Judge Thorne stated, her voice dry and formal. "The petitioners claim that the respondent is currently suffering from a severe acute mental health crisis, rendering her entirely incapable of managing her personal affairs and her vast financial portfolio, specifically Apex Holdings." Judge Thorne looked directly at Catherine. "Mrs. Vanguard, this is an extreme legal measure. You are asking this court to completely strip an adult woman, a highly successful CEO, of her basic autonomy. I need to hear your reasoning, and it needs to be compelling." Catherine did not hesitate. She took a slow, shuddering breath, her hands trembling as she clasped them tightly on the table. It was the beginning of an Oscar-worthy performance. "Your Honor," Catherine began, her voice breaking with perfectly timed emotion, "this is the hardest thing a mother could ever do. My husband and I are absolutely terrified for our daughter. 12 years ago, Sienna suffered a devastating depressive episode. She was hospitalized. She was medicated. We thought she had recovered, but she simply pushed us away and disappeared into her work." A single tear escaped her eye, tracking a slow path down her cheek. Thomas placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, playing his supporting role flawlessly. For a decade, we respected her boundaries. Catherine continued, her voice gaining a desperate pleading edge. But over the last 48 hours, she has completely unraveled. The hostile takeover of our family business, Vanguard Estates, was not a rational financial decision. It was a manic, vindictive attack. She is destroying our legacy, but more importantly, she is destroying herself. She is erratic, she is paranoid, and she is making billion-dollar decisions driven by a sick, delusional vendetta. We are begging you, Your Honor, please give us the authority to step in and get our little girl the medical help she so desperately needs before she loses everything. Catherine lowered her head, softly weeping into a tissue. Her attorneys nodded sympathetically, presenting the 12-year-old medical records to the judge as if they were current, indisputable proof of my insanity. The performance was sickeningly effective. If I hadn't been the target of her lies, I might have almost believed the desperate mother narrative she was spinning. Judge Thorne looked troubled. She reviewed the old medical files, then turned her sharp gaze toward my legal team. Counsel Judge Thorne said, her tone cautious. The petitioners have presented a narrative of severe escalating instability. How does the respondent answer these incredibly serious allegations? My lead attorney, a razor-sharp litigator named Evelyn Vance, stood up. She did not raise her voice. She did not offer a passionate, emotional defense. She simply picked up a sleek silver laptop and placed it directly in front of the judge. Your Honor. Evelyn said, her voice smooth and deadly. The petitioners have spun a very compelling, highly emotional piece of fiction today. They rely heavily on medical records that are over a decade old, completely ignoring the respondent's flawless, incredibly successful 10-year track record as the CEO of Apex Holdings. However, we do not need to argue about the past. We have absolute, irrefutable proof of the petitioner's true motives and their own profoundly vicious mental state, recorded less than 72 hours ago. Evelyn tapped the keyboard. Your Honor, I present Exhibit A, the security footage and unedited audio from the private dining room at Le Ciel restaurant, legally subpoenaed by our team yesterday afternoon. The video flared to life on the laptop screen. The high-definition camera captured the entire scene perfectly. It showed the luxurious room, the 12 occupied chairs, and me standing quietly near the door. The audio, enhanced and crystal clear, filled the judge's chambers. The recording played my mother's cruel, mocking voice, completely stripped of the fragile victim persona she was currently wearing. You have always insisted on doing things your own mediocre way, Sienna. You refused to join Vanguard Estates. You refused to marry a man of proper standing. You chose this difficult, unrewarding path for yourself. So just sit on the floor, darling. The floor suits you perfectly. The video clearly captured Madison and Andre bursting into cruel laughter, validating the abuse. It showed Catherine smirking, her eyes filled with malicious, triumphant glee. Then the video showed my reaction. I did not yell. I did not cry. I calmly placed the velvet box on the table, offered a polite, icy smile, and walked out with absolute dignity. Judge Thorne stared at the screen, her expression hardening with every second that passed. The contrast between the weeping, concerned mother sitting in her chambers and the vicious, arrogant bully on the video was staggering. Evelyn paused the video. As you can see, Your Honor, my client is not suffering from a manic episode. She is exhibiting profound restraint in the face of targeted public psychological abuse by the very people claiming to be terrified for her well-being. The acquisition of Vanguard Estates was not a psychotic break. It was a perfectly executed, rational response to a hostile family dynamic and a highly profitable business maneuver. The petitioners are not trying to save my client. They are trying to steal her company because she legally outsmarted them. The silence in the judge's chambers was deafening. The trap had snapped shut. Catherine's fake tears had completely dried up her face, turning a sickly, mottled shade of white. Thomas stared at the paused video, looking as if the floor had just dropped out from beneath him. Their expensive attorneys shifted uncomfortably in their seats, instantly realizing their clients had blatantly lied to them and handed them a completely unwinnable, fraudulent case. Judge Thorne slowly removed her reading glasses, her eyes fixed on Catherine with a look of absolute, unvarnished disgust. The air in the room was completely toxic, poisoned by the undeniable proof of my parents' sheer malice. They had tried to destroy me with lies, and I had just buried them with the truth. Evelyn did not pause to allow my parents to recover. She capitalized on the stunned silence, moving with the lethal efficiency of a seasoned litigator who knew she had the opposition entirely cornered. The video evidence had thoroughly dismantled Catherine's carefully constructed narrative of maternal concern, but Evelyn was not finished. She was preparing to deliver the final crushing blow that would permanently neutralize any lingering threat my family posed to my empire. Your Honor, Evelyn said, her voice remaining perfectly level. The footage clearly establishes my client's absolute mental acuity and the petitioner's profound malicious intent. However, to truly understand the desperation driving this fraudulent conservatorship petition, we must examine the financial reality that the petitioners are attempting to conceal. The acquisition of Vanguard Estates was not merely a strategic business move by my client. It was the catalyst that exposed a decade-long criminal conspiracy orchestrated by Catherine and Thomas Vanguard. Evelyn reached into her leather briefcase and extracted a thick, heavily bound dossier, identical to the one I had presented to my family in the penthouse. She placed it on Judge Thorne's desk with a resounding thud. During the standard due diligence process leading up to the acquisition of Vanguard Estates, Evelyn explained my client's forensic accounting team uncovered severe financial irregularities. While investigating the staggering corporate debt accumulated under the petitioner's leadership, the auditors traced a series of unauthorized, highly obfuscated capital injections used to artificially inflate Vanguard's failing operational accounts. Judge Thorne leaned forward, her brow furrowing as she opened the dossier. The atmosphere in the chambers shifted from tense to dangerously electrified. Catherine's face lost all remaining color, transforming into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Thomas gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles turned white, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy oak doors as if calculating an escape route. Their attorneys, realizing the magnitude of the situation they had been blindly dragged into, sat perfectly still, radiating professional panic. Evelyn did not miss a beat. The auditors discovered that these capital injections were not generated by legitimate business operations or secured loans. She continued, her voice crisp and unforgiving. They were systematically funneled from a private offshore trust account. A trust account established 12 years ago by the late Arthur Vanguard Sienna's paternal grandfather. I watched my father flinch at the mention of his own father's name. Arthur Vanguard had been a shrewd, pragmatic businessman who had built the foundation of the family wealth before Catherine's vanity spending began to erode it. He had always seen through my mother's superficial facade, and he had recognized the toxic dynamic she cultivated within the family. When he passed away, he had attempted to protect me, establishing an irrevocable trust designed to secure my future entirely independent of my parents' control. He had explicitly instructed his attorneys to keep the existence of the trust hidden from Catherine until I reached the age of 25. Unfortunately, my grandfather had severely underestimated my mother's ruthlessness and my father's weak complicity. When I suffered my depressive episode during college, effectively vanishing from their lives to protect my own sanity, they seized the opportunity. They used the exact same medical records they presented today to convince the original trustees that I was incapacitated and unable to manage the inheritance. They manipulated the legal framework, installed themselves as the primary financial stewards of the trust, and subsequently treated it as their own personal slush fund. Your Honor, Evelyn stated, her tone sharpening the dossier, before you contains irrefutable proof that for the past decade, Catherine and Thomas Vanguard have systematically embezzled over $40 million from Sienna Vanguard's private trust. The number echoed in the small chambers, a staggering figure that crystallized the absolute depravity of my parents' actions. They hadn't just abandoned me, they had actively stolen my future to fund their own reckless extravagance. Evelyn pointed to a specific tab within the dossier. The financial tracing is absolute, she continued. The stolen funds were not solely used to prop up the failing Vanguard estates. Millions of dollars were diverted to support the luxurious lifestyle of their younger daughter Madison, including the purchase of her $3 million residence. Furthermore, significant portions of Sienna's inheritance were utilized to pay exorbitant legal retainers to Andre Madison's husband, effectively funneling stolen wealth directly into his corporate law firm. I watched my parents as the crushing weight of their crimes was laid bare before the judge. The realization that their entire gilded existence, the mansion, the cars, the country club status, Madison's designer wardrobe, Andre's smug superiority, was entirely subsidized by the daughter they had relentlessly mocked and discarded, was finally sinking in. They had spent a decade believing they were superior, all while secretly feeding off the wealth my grandfather had intended for me. The emergency conservatorship petition filed before this court today is not an act of parental love. Evelyn concluded, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. It is a desperate, calculated attempt by the petitioners to regain control over the victim of their massive financial fraud. By obtaining legal authority over my client, they intended to instantly reverse the Vanguard acquisition, bury the evidence of their embezzlement, and permanently silence the only person capable of holding them accountable. Judge Thorne closed the dossier slowly. She removed her reading glasses and placed them deliberately on the desk. The expression on her face was one of profound, chilling outrage. She looked at Catherine and Thomas, her eyes narrowing with undisguised contempt. The silence in the chambers was absolute, heavy with the terrifying reality of the legal reckoning that was about to occur. Mrs. Vanguard! Mr. Vanguard! Judge Thorne began, her voice dangerously low and resonant. In my 20 years on the bench, I have presided over complex family disputes, bitter divorces, and contentious probate hearings. However, the level of calculated malice, breathtaking fraud, and absolute disregard for your own daughter's well-being presented in this chamber today is entirely unprecedented. The judge paused, letting her condemnation hang in the air, ensuring every single syllable struck with maximum impact. Catherine opened her mouth, a desperate, tearful defense forming on her lips, but Judge Thorne immediately raised a hand, silencing her with absolute authority. "Do not speak," the judge commanded, her voice cracking like a whip. "You have already said more than enough. The evidence before me is unequivocal. This court will not be weaponized to facilitate a criminal conspiracy, nor will it tolerate the blatant manipulation of the judicial system to silence a victim of profound financial abuse." The trap had closed completely. There was no escape, no negotiation, and absolutely no mercy left for the family that had offered me the floor. The execution was complete. Now the sentencing would begin. Judge Thorne did not lower her voice. She leaned forward, her heavy wooden gavel resting near her hand, a physical symbol of the absolute ruin she was about to rain down upon my parents. "The emergency petition for conservatorship is hereby dismissed with prejudice." Judge Thorne declared, her words striking the quiet room like physical blows. "This means you are permanently barred from ever bringing this fraudulent, malicious claim before this or any other court in the state of Illinois again. You attempted to misuse the judicial system to enslave your daughter and cover up a multi-million-dollar theft. I will not allow my courtroom to be the final stage for your decade of relentless abuse." Catherine sobbed, a loud, ugly sound that garnered absolutely zero sympathy from anyone in the room. Thomas stared blankly ahead, his breathing shallow and rapid. Furthermore, Judge Thorne continued, her tone growing even colder. "I am not simply dismissing this case. As an officer of the court, I am legally and ethically obligated to report profound financial crimes when irrefutable evidence is presented in my chambers. I am ordering my clerk to make an official certified copy of the dossier provided by the respondent's legal team. I am personally forwarding this entire file to the Cook County District Attorney and the White Collar Crime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The color completely drained from my father's face. He knew exactly what federal involvement meant. It meant prison. In addition, the judge stated, to ensure that restitution is possible for the victim of this staggering embezzlement, I am issuing an immediate emergency freeze on all personal bank accounts, offshore holdings, and physical assets currently registered to Catherine and Thomas Vanguard. You are ordered to repay the stolen trust funds in their entirety. Given the magnitude of the theft, you are effectively bankrupt as of this exact second. You are dismissed. Evelyn closed her laptop with a sharp, satisfying click. I stood up carefully, smoothing my sharp black suit. I did not look at my parents as they were practically scraped off their chairs by their terrified, defeated attorneys. They had walked into the courthouse expecting to strip me of my human rights and walk out with my multi-billion-dollar empire. Instead, they were leaving with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the absolute certainty of imminent federal indictments. They were penniless and entirely destroyed. I walked out of the courthouse and stepped into the bright Chicago afternoon. I inhaled a deep breath of the crisp air. The heavy, suffocating chain that had tied me to their toxic expectations and constant abuse was finally permanently broken. I was free. But a dying parasite does not simply let go without a final desperate thrashing. While my parents were busy consulting criminal defense attorneys, they could no longer afford the shockwaves of my financial execution were tearing through the rest of the family. Across the city, inside a sprawling $3 million Gold Coast mansion, my sister Madison was experiencing her own personal apocalypse. The illusion of her perfect, heavily filtered life had been utterly annihilated. Her husband Andre had fled the state hours after signing the divorce papers, leaving behind a mountain of illegal gambling debts and a shredded legal career. The bank alerted to the frozen Vanguard accounts, and the federal fraud investigation had immediately initiated aggressive foreclosure proceedings on her home. The mansion purchased with the very trust funds my parents had stolen from me was no longer hers. Madison sat on the floor of her massive custom-built walk-in closet. Designer gowns, imported handbags, and expensive shoes were scattered everywhere in a chaotic mess. She was frantically trying to pack her most valuable items into designer luggage before the bank sent agents to physically seize the property. She was drinking expensive champagne straight from the bottle, her hands shaking violently, her perfect makeup smeared and ruined by hours of hysterical crying. She was totally broke. Her black credit cards were declining. Her wealthy socialite friends, the exact same women who had eagerly laughed at me during my birthday dinner, were actively ignoring her calls. In the ruthless, unforgiving hierarchy of Chicago high society, a looming federal fraud scandal and a sudden plunge into poverty made you instantly toxic. She was a complete social pariah. But Madison did not possess the capacity for self-reflection. She did not blame her mother for stealing my inheritance. She did not blame her husband for embezzling company funds. Her narcissistic mind, molded by decades of being the untouchable golden child, directed every ounce of her venom entirely toward me. She firmly believed that I was the villain who had unjustly stolen her rightful throne and deliberately ruined her flawless existence. She gripped the empty champagne bottle tightly, her knuckles turning stark white. She refused to accept that she was destined to become a regular working-class citizen. She refused to sit on the floor of her ruined life while I soared in the penthouse of my new empire. She needed a way to force my hand to create a spectacle so massive and so publicly damaging that I would have no choice but to pay her off just to make it go away. Madison dropped the bottle and grabbed her phone, her thumbs flying across the screen as she furiously searched the local Chicago Society news pages. She knew I could not be touched in a boardroom or a courtroom. I was too insulated, too protected by my elite security team and my vicious lawyers. But she also knew that a billionaire CEO could not hide in the shadows forever. I had a public image to maintain now. She found exactly what she was looking for on the front page of a prominent philanthropic website. A massive, glittering banner advertisement announcing the upcoming Apex Holdings Charity Gala, an exclusive, highly publicized event hosted by the elusive Sienna Vanguard at the Field Museum. The gala was the premier social event of the entire season, guaranteed to be crawling with international press, elite investors, and the city's most powerful political figures. A dark smile spread across Madison's tear-stained face. It was the perfect target. She was going to infiltrate the gala. She was going to wait until the cameras were rolling and the world was watching. Then she was going to crash the stage and unleash a performance that would destroy my reputation forever. She was going to make me pay for ruining her life no matter the cost. Exactly 1 month later, the freezing Chicago winds had given way to a crisp, clear winter evening. The historic stone facade of the Field Museum of Natural History was brilliantly illuminated with towering beams of icy blue and crisp white light. A massive, flawless red carpet stretched down the grand, sweeping front steps, flanked by velvet ropes and a small army of heavily armed private security personnel. Tonight was the inaugural Apex Holdings Philanthropic Gala. It was no longer just a corporate event. It was the definitive, undisputed social pinnacle of the entire Chicago season. Every single billionaire, elite politician, and media executive in the Midwest had fiercely lobbied for an invitation to this highly exclusive gathering. The guest list was a masterclass in power and influence, and I was the absolute center of their entire universe. My convoy of matte black armored SUVs glided to a smooth halt at the base of the museum steps. My security director opened my door, offering his hand. I stepped out into the flashing explosion of hundreds of camera lenses. The roar of the gathered press corps was deafening. I was not wearing an unbranded practical blazer tonight. I wore a breathtaking custom-designed emerald green gown that swept gracefully across the red carpet. It was a masterpiece of high fashion dripping with subtle, staggering wealth and absolute undeniable authority. My hair was swept up into an elegant, flawless style, and a simple but blindingly expensive diamond necklace rested against my collarbone. I did not look like a woman who had recently survived a vicious family coup. I looked like a woman who had successfully conquered the entire city and was now graciously allowing everyone else to merely exist within it. Reporters strained against the velvet ropes, thrusting microphones in my direction. "Sienna, Sienna, over here!" The voices overlapped in a frantic chorus. "How does it feel to be named the most influential CEO of the year? Can you comment on the incredible 40% surge in Vanguard Estates' profitability since your aggressive acquisition? What inspired your staggering $50 million donation to the Chicago Youth Mental Health Initiative tonight?" I paused near the center of the carpet, turning to face the flashing cameras. I offered them a warm, perfectly calibrated, completely confident smile. It was the exact smile of a seasoned, untouchable titan of industry. I stepped toward the nearest prominent financial journalist, a woman who had written a glowing editorial about my brutal surgical destruction of the fraudulent conservatorship petition. "Thank you," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the chaotic din of the press line. "Tonight is not about corporate acquisitions or past legal victories. Tonight is entirely about giving back to the city that has allowed Apex Holdings to thrive so spectacularly. We are here to ensure that vulnerable individuals have the absolute best resources to protect their mental health and secure their own independent futures." The reporters scribbled furiously on their notepads, captivated by my every word. They did not see me as the pathetic, troubled daughter my mother had desperately tried to paint me as. They saw a brilliant, resilient, unstoppable philanthropic powerhouse. They saw a woman who had faced a massive, highly publicized betrayal by her own blood and had emerged from the ashes stronger, wealthier, and more universally respected than ever before. I gracefully excused myself from the press line and ascended the grand stairs of the museum. The heavy glass doors were pulled open by gloved attendants, ushering me into the breathtaking main hall. The massive, towering skeleton of the famous Tyrannosaurus Rex served as the dramatic centerpiece of the room, surrounded by dozens of elegantly decorated banquet tables. Crystal glassware sparkled under the warm ambient lighting. A renowned string quartet played softly from a raised balcony, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to the evening. Waiters in pristine tuxedos circulated through the rapidly filling room, carrying silver trays of expensive champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. As I walked across the polished marble floor, the most powerful people in Chicago parted like the Red Sea to let me pass. Mayors, senators, and rival hedge fund managers all nodded with profound, genuine respect. I was no longer an anonymous ghost manipulating the markets from a hidden penthouse. I was the undisputed queen of the board. The transition had been intense, but incredibly validating. In the 4 weeks since the disastrous closed-door hearing, my life had accelerated at a dizzying pace. My elite restructuring team had entirely purged the Vanguard Estates corporate offices. We fired every single useless, overpaid executive my parents had installed. We renegotiated the toxic loans, liquidated the failing vanity projects, and stabilized the core assets. The market responded with overwhelming immediate enthusiasm. My parents, meanwhile, had vanished into complete obscurity, stripped of their stolen wealth and facing imminent, highly severe federal indictments for their massive trust fund embezzlement. They had been forced to vacate their sprawling suburban estate. They were hiding in a modest rented apartment, terrified to show their faces in public. Their former high society friends had abandoned them instantly, treating their impending criminal charges like a highly contagious disease. They were bankrupt, disgraced, and completely powerless. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and took a slow, satisfying sip. I looked around the glittering room, taking in the absolute perfection of the event I had orchestrated. This gala was my ultimate victory lap. It was a flawless, undeniable physical manifestation of my total triumph over the people who had tried to destroy me. I felt entirely secure. My security team was the best in the business, monitoring every single entrance and exit with military precision. The guest list had been vetted and cross-referenced 3 times to ensure absolutely no unwanted individuals could breach the perimeter. I was surrounded by allies, investors, and admirers. There was nothing that could ruin this perfect, triumphant evening. I took another sip of my champagne, completely ready for the night. While I stood bathed in the warm glow of the museum chandeliers, a different scene unfolded in the freezing service alley behind the building. Catherine, Thomas, and Madison huddled behind a row of industrial dumpsters, shivering violently against the biting Chicago wind. They were completely unrecognizable from the arrogant, untouchable family that had mocked me at Le Ciel just 1 month ago. Catherine wore an outdated evening gown pulled from the back of her remaining wardrobe. Her normally flawless hair was flattened by the harsh wind, and the frantic, hollow look in her eyes betrayed the absolute desperation consuming her mind. Thomas looked like a broken old man, his tuxedo hanging loosely on his rapidly shrinking frame. He kept checking his phone, terrified an incoming call would be a federal agent executing their arrest warrants. Madison stood between them, her teeth chattering audibly. She clutched a crumpled fake VIP lanyard in her trembling hands. Her mansion was gone. Her husband had abandoned her. Her credit cards were declined everywhere. She had absolutely nothing left except a burning, obsessive hatred for the sister who had stripped away her unearned luxury. They were out of options. The federal indictments for their embezzlement loomed over them like a guillotine. Their former friends refused to answer their desperate calls. They were facing total financial ruin and federal prison time. This charity gala was their absolute last resort. It was a chaotic, high-risk gamble born of pure desperation. Catherine had meticulously planned this infiltration using her last shreds of social capital. 2 days prior, she had tracked down a mid-level catering manager who used to service the Vanguard Estates corporate holiday parties. Through emotional manipulation and a desperate bribe, she had secured 3 counterfeit vendor passes designed to grant them access through the museum's underground loading dock. Catherine grabbed Madison by the shoulders forcefully. She pulled her golden child close, her voice a frantic whisper. "Listen to me very carefully, Madison. We only get one shot at this. You have to be absolutely perfect tonight. You are the victim. You are the heartbroken, destitute sister who has been cruelly cast out into the freezing streets by a greedy, sociopathic billionaire. When we get inside, you keep your head down and stay in the shadows until she takes the stage. Do you understand me?" Madison nodded, her eyes wide and manic. She rehearsed her fake tears, perfectly manufacturing the exact look of profound tragedy she planned to broadcast to the entire world. Thomas rubbed his freezing hands together, his voice shaking with raw terror. "Catherine, if we get caught doing this, the judge will revoke our bail agreements. We could be arrested right here on the museum steps." Catherine shot him a look of absolute venom. "We are already going to prison, Thomas. Unless we force her hand tonight, our lives are completely over. Their strategy relied entirely upon the unpredictable power of public opinion. They knew that the Apex Holdings Philanthropic Gala was being live-streamed globally to millions of investors, charity organizations, and financial news outlets. They understood that I had carefully cultivated a pristine, untouchable public image over the past 4 weeks. Catherine firmly believed that if Madison stormed the main stage during the highly anticipated keynote speech, the sheer shock value would completely paralyze my security team. Madison would violently grab the microphone and unleash a perfectly scripted hysterical performance. She would publicly accuse me of destroying our family out of pure, unprovoked spite. She would claim that I had illegally seized Vanguard estates and driven my own loving parents into absolute poverty. Catherine's twisted logic dictated that the incredibly wealthy image-conscious donors in the audience would instantly turn against me. She calculated that the brutal public pressure combined with the catastrophic risk of a viral public relations nightmare would force me to instantly surrender. She genuinely thought I would publicly agree to a massive financial settlement and drop the criminal embezzlement charges just to silence the screaming, crying sister on my stage and save my corporate reputation. It was the ultimate desperate act of a narcissist who still believed she could control the narrative through sheer emotional terrorism. Catherine checked her watch, noting the exact time the keynote address was scheduled to begin. She signaled to Thomas and Madison, and the 3 disgraced family members crept out from behind the dumpsters. They approached the heavy steel doors of the underground service entrance. 2 massive private security guards stood at the checkpoint scanning vendor badges with digital readers. Catherine held her breath, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She handed the counterfeit passes to the guard. The scanner beeped a sharp mechanical sound that seemed to echo in the concrete tunnel. The light flashed green. The catering manager had successfully bypassed the encryption. The guard waved them through without a second glance, completely unaware that he had just allowed the greatest threat to my empire directly into the building. The trio slipped into the sprawling network of service corridors beneath the museum. They navigated the labyrinth of stainless steel kitchens and busy catering staff, keeping their faces hidden behind oversized catering trays. They quietly ascended a service stairwell and slipped through a discreet side door, stepping directly into the shadows of the massive main exhibition hall. The glittering elite crowd was completely oblivious to their presence. Madison hid behind a towering marble column, her eyes scanning the room until she spotted me. I was standing near the front of the stage, glowing under the crystal chandeliers, surrounded by adoring investors. A wave of pure toxic jealousy boiled over in Madison's chest. She tightened her grip on her outdated dress. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the podium, tapping the microphone to signal the start of the keynote presentation. The countdown had officially begun. Madison took a deep, shuddering breath, completely ready to sprint out of the darkness right now and utterly destroy my perfect night. The master of ceremonies leaned into the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my absolute honor to introduce the founder and CEO of Apex Holdings, a woman whose vision is reshaping Chicago. Please welcome Sienna. The applause was deafening. It rolled through the room like thunder vibrating against the polished marble floors. I stepped out from the wings and walked toward the stage. The warmth of the spotlight hit my face, but it was the genuine respect radiating from the audience that truly illuminated the moment. I approached the sleek acrylic podium, looking out over the sea of Chicago's elite. I smiled, raising my hand slightly to quiet the roaring crowd. "Thank you," I began, my voice projecting with steady authority. Tonight represents more than just a philanthropic milestone. It represents the breaking of generational cycles. It is about providing a lifeline to those who have been manipulated and discarded by the people who were supposed to protect them. I was about to transition to the funding initiatives when a commotion erupted near the left side of the stage. A figure burst from the shadows. It was Madison. She shoved an usher aside with desperate strength and sprinted up the stairs. Her dress caught on the railing, tearing slightly, but she did not stop. The audience let out a gasp as she rushed across the floor. Before my security detail could intercept her, she lunged toward the secondary microphone stand and ripped the microphone from its cradle. "Do not listen to her," Madison screamed, her voice echoing shrilly through the museum hall. "She is a monster. She is a sociopath." My security director sprinted across the stage to tackle her. I raised my right hand. "Stop! Let her speak," I commanded. The security team froze instantly, creating a tight perimeter, but allowing Madison the center stage. I stepped back from my podium, projecting absolute chilling calm. Madison panted heavily, clutching the microphone with white knuckles. She looked out at the shocked billionaires. She forced a sob, squeezing her eyes shut to produce fake tears. "This woman, this supposed philanthropist, is my sister," Madison cried, her voice cracking with manufactured agony. "She is standing up here talking about helping people, but she just destroyed her own flesh and blood. She stole our family company. She threw our loving parents out into the freezing streets. Because of her vindictive jealousy, I have lost my home. My husband was driven away. We have absolutely nothing left." Madison fell to her knees, clutching her chest in a display of melodramatic suffering. "She took everything from us just to feed her sick ego. How can you give her your money? How can you applaud a woman who leaves her own family completely destitute and starving?" The vast hall was dead silent. The crowd shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few wealthy socialites whispered behind their hands, casting uneasy glances in my direction. The reporters in the back row were typing on their phones, sensing a scandalous viral moment. Madison looked up at me through her messy hair, a triumphant, malicious smirk flashing briefly across her face. She truly believed she had won. She thought she had successfully weaponized my charity gala against me. She expected me to panic, to call security, or to desperately defend myself. I did none of those things. I simply looked down at her kneeling on the stage floor and I smiled. It was the same cold, lethal smile I had given her mother 1 month ago. "Are you quite finished, Madison?" I asked, my voice carrying clearly through my lapel microphone. "Because if your performance is over, I have a short video presentation I would love to share with the audience." Madison faltered, her fake sobs hitching in her throat. She looked confused, entirely thrown off by my total lack of panic. I lifted my gaze and looked straight over the heads of the audience, locking eyes with my technical director in the AV booth. I gave a single sharp nod. The brilliant stage lights dimmed instantly. The massive high-definition LED screens positioned behind us suddenly went completely black. Then a loud electronic chime echoed through the sound system. The screens flared to life, switching directly to a live feed from a national news network. A bright red banner flashed across the bottom of the screens. "Breaking news, federal indictments unsealed." The speakers pumped the news anchor's voice throughout the hall, drowning out Madison's panicked breathing. "We are interrupting our broadcast with a developing story," the anchor announced, his image towering behind us. "The Department of Justice has just unsealed a federal indictment against the former executive board of Vanguard Estates. Arrest warrants are being executed for Catherine and Thomas, along with attorney Andre. The charges include wire fraud, aggressive tax evasion, and the systematic embezzlement of $40 million from a private trust fund." The FBI confirmed that Andre was apprehended less than an hour ago while attempting to board a flight out of Chicago. The charity gala erupted into shock. The wealthy investors gasped out loud. The journalists abandoned their previous story, entirely raising their cameras to capture the catastrophic downfall of the once proud family. The whispers of doubt that Madison had planted instantly transformed into loud expressions of profound disgust directed entirely at her. Madison remained kneeling on the stage floor. She slowly turned her head to look at the massive LED screen behind her. She watched the news footage of federal agents raiding her parents' apartment. She saw the graphic displaying her mother, her father, and her husband with the word "indicted" stamped in bold red letters across their faces. The microphone slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the polished stage floor with an electronic screech. The fake tears on her cheeks were immediately replaced by genuine terror. She finally understood that I had orchestrated a massive public execution that she could never escape. She finally understood that I had orchestrated a massive public execution that she could never escape. The massive LED screen behind us shifted again, cutting to live aerial footage from O'Hare International Airport. A news helicopter hovered above the dark tarmac, zooming in tightly on a frantic figure surrounded by flashing police lights. It was Andre. He was violently pinned against the hood of an unmarked black sedan by heavily armed federal agents, his expensive luggage scattered across the wet concrete. He had tried to flee the country with whatever stolen funds he could liquidate, but my security contractors had tipped off the authorities hours ago. The arrogant golden couple was now a spectacular, nationally televised tragedy. The wealthy donors and influential politicians in the audience turned their disgusted gaze back to Madison. The elite society she worshipped was actively watching her family burn, and they were firmly on my side. Before Madison could attempt to formulate another pathetic lie, the heavy oak doors at the rear of the Grand Exhibition Hall swung open with a resounding crash. Two groups of stern men and women wearing dark windbreakers with prominent FBI lettering across the back marched into the ballroom. They moved with absolute terrifying purpose. The high society crowd parted instantly. Sandwiched between the agents struggling weakly against the tight steel handcuffs binding their wrists were Catherine and Thomas. They had been intercepted at the service entrance, dragged out from the shadows, and brought directly into the blazing light of the main hall. My mother looked entirely feral. Her outdated evening gown was snagged and torn from hiding behind dumpsters. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure panic. My father simply wept, a broken man who had run out of other people's money. The federal agents marched them straight down the center aisle, parading them past the very billionaires my mother had spent her life trying to impress. The humiliation was total and permanent. They reached the base of the stage. The lead federal agent looked up at me, offering a professional nod before turning his attention to the shrieking woman in his custody. Catherine thrashed against the agent's grip, her eyes locking onto mine with terrified desperation. She tried to pull her classic manipulation tactic, pitching her voice to sound like a victimized mother. "Sienna, please!" Catherine begged, her voice cracking as the cameras flashed relentlessly. "You have to stop this. Tell them it is a terrible misunderstanding. We are family. You cannot let them take us away in front of all these people." I stepped up to the edge of the stage, looking down at the ruined woman who had actively tried to destroy my spirit. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I felt nothing but the pristine clarity of absolute justice. I leaned into my lapel microphone, ensuring my final words to her would echo through the museum and be recorded by every news outlet. "Family builds each other up," I stated, my voice echoing like a steel blade dropping onto marble. "Parasites drain their hosts until there is nothing left. You made your choice when you stole my future to fund your vanity. I am simply ensuring you finally pay the bill." Catherine opened her mouth to scream another defense, but I cut her off, delivering the final fatal strike. "I hear federal prison does not have enough chairs in the processing holding cells," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. "The floor will suit you perfectly." Catherine gasped the words, hitting her like a physical blow. She recognized her own cruel insult thrown back at her as a life sentence. The federal agents did not give her time to respond. They forcefully turned her and Thomas around, marching the disgraced executives out of the museum and straight into the waiting armored transport vehicles. Madison watched her parents being dragged away, her body shaking uncontrollably. She was still kneeling on the cold stage, completely surrounded by the shattered ruins of her fake reality. She had no husband, no parents, no mansion, and zero social standing. She dropped her head into her hands and wept, left with nothing but the bitter consequences of her arrogance. Two female security guards stepped forward, hoisting Madison to her feet by her arms. They escorted the sobbing, ruined golden child off the stage and out the side exit, removing the trash from my venue. The disruptive chaos vanished with them. I turned back to my podium, offering the stunned audience a warm, reassuring smile. They erupted into a standing ovation, applauding the survivor. The gala resumed flawlessly, raising a record-breaking amount of capital for mental health initiatives. Hours later, the final guest departed. I walked out through the heavy glass doors of the Field Museum and stepped onto the grand stone stairs. The freezing Chicago night air hit my face, but it felt incredibly refreshing. I looked out at the glittering city skyline, realizing that for the first time in my existence, I was completely free. The heavy, suffocating chain that had bound me to their toxic expectations was permanently shattered. The next morning, my legal team finalized the recovery of my grandfather's stolen trust fund. I did not absorb the $40 million back into Apex Holdings. Instead, I signed a single sweeping directive. I donated every single recovered penny to a newly established foundation dedicated entirely to providing aggressive legal support and psychological therapy for victims of severe narcissistic family abuse. I would never be forced to sit on the floor again, and I was going to ensure that anyone who tried to push others down would find themselves facing an absolute impenetrable fortress. I walked to my waiting car, my head held high, ready to conquer the world I had built with my very own two hands. The narrative of Sienna's devastating yet triumphant journey highlights a profound and difficult truth about toxic dynamics. Biological ties do not guarantee unconditional love or loyalty. When faced with relentless narcissistic abuse, the most powerful response is not to engage in an emotional screaming match, but to quietly and methodically build your own absolute independence. For years, Sienna was the designated scapegoat, subjected to cruel mockery and deliberately excluded from the table of her own life. Her family sought to keep her on the floor, confusing her strategic silence for weakness. However, the core lesson here is that true strength is often forged in the shadows. Instead of desperately seeking validation from people entirely incapable of giving it, she channeled her trauma into building an impenetrable, self-sufficient empire. She teaches us that we cannot heal in the same environment that broke us, nor can we reason with people who are committed to misunderstanding us. Furthermore, this story perfectly illustrates the vital importance of ironclad boundaries. Society often pushes immediate forgiveness as a mandatory step for healing, but Sienna demonstrates that establishing firm, non-negotiable boundaries and allowing toxic individuals to face the natural, brutal consequences of their own actions is a profoundly valid and necessary form of self-love. Her ultimate victory was not merely acquiring immense wealth or executing a corporate takeover. It was permanently severing the emotional chains that bound her to their toxic expectations, ultimately using her hard-won freedom to uplift other survivors of abuse. You do not have to accept the floor just because someone else told you that is where you belong. If you are currently standing in the shadow of a toxic environment, take that first brave step today to reclaim your narrative and start building your own independent future.